Welcome. Good evening, good afternoon. I want to send out a welcome to the students in Oregon, in North Carolina, to folks in Florida and in Massachusetts, and also to the handful of students who have decided to come in live tonight here with me. We'll be presenting a lecture on confronting the stigma of mental illness with empowerment and advocacy. My name is Cheryl Gagne, and I am a Senior Research and Training Associate at the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation here at Boston University. The center is a research and training institute, which has three separate branches that inform one another. The first is a research branch in which we study and do research in the field of mental health, primarily focusing on people who experience the most severe psychiatric illnesses and consequently experience psychiatric disability. Our training division conducts training such as this, but also across the country and internationally, conducting training to practitioners, family members, and people who use mental health services. And finally, our services division, last but not least, we are able to offer people in the greater Boston area psychiatric rehabilitation services that are recovery-oriented. And you'll be hearing a little bit more about the Recovery Education Center later in this presentation. I want to turn to the agenda for tonight's lecture. We're going to begin by talking very briefly about some definitions and concepts. We're going to talk also about the relationship of stigma and mental illness. Why is mental illness stigmatized? We'll hit upon the consequences of stigma. How does that impact the lives of people who live with psychiatric illness, their family members, and indeed all people in society? Next, we'll look at coping and confronting stigma. How can we live with stigma in our presence and work to cope with it personally, but also reduce it in our society? I will be talking about a particular program that we offer here in our Recovery Education Center called the Anti-Stigma Empowerment and Advocacy Photovoice. And finally, I want to talk about stigma and discrimination on college campuses. Okay, I think it's very relevant, particularly for college students, to look at the presence of the stigma of mental illness on college campuses today. So I won't be talking a lot about research, although there's a huge body of research. And I really won't be touching upon cultural aspects of stigma, although it's fascinating and I encourage you to read it. I want to begin with a slide first to anchor us into the why are we doing this? Why do we even care about stigma and mental illness? Just to kind of begin by thinking about its seriousness and its impact. And again, we'll talk about some other consequences later. But I wanted to make the point that for many people, stigma is the most difficult aspect of the experience of mental illness to overcome. Stigma prevents people from getting treatment and support services for their condition. Stigma fuels discrimination of people who have been diagnosed with mental illness. Stigma also fuels fear and mistrust in our society. And finally, stigma is pervasive. It's very difficult to eliminate. And it's quite, it's not a thing of the past. Someone was saying to me, I can't believe it's not 1940 anymore, and yet we're still dealing with a lot of stigma about mental illness, despite the information that's known about neurological problems, brain disorders, about the fact that most mental illnesses have treatment that is effective, enabling people, supporting people to live full lives. And I have a recent and relevant experience, a story that came from our Boston Globe just this Sunday. And it's a story about a woman named Maria Hornbacher, who is an author. She's written 3 books, a young woman. And her most recent book is called Madness, A Bipolar Life, which is a first-hand account of her experience. And I'm going to read what she wrote about this experience at a book signing. I don't know if you've ever gone to a book signing, but they're wonderful, and the author will read aloud and talk about what motivated her writing, and then afterwards sign books if people purchase them there. So here's what Maria Hornbacher says. I recently wrote a memoir on living with bipolar disorder. I was signing books at a lecture. A woman came up to the table, and after saying all sorts of earnest things about how important it was to break down stigma, broaden understanding, and so forth, she suddenly gasped. "Is that a wedding ring on your hand?" she asked. I looked down, and indeed it was a wedding ring. So I said, "Yes." "You're married?" she asked. I said that I was. "My God," she said, "he must be an amazing man." Off and on, more or less," she replied. "Well," she said, looking alarmed, "but you don't have children, do you? I mean, you wouldn't want to pass on your genes." I froze. "Right," I said, and smiled and signed her book. Apparently, I hadn't quite made my point, because after 45 minutes of going on about the facts that mental illness is highly treatable, that one can live and live well when one has it, and that my life as a person with mental illness is quite average, should come away with, mentally ill people are so warped that it's a miracle anyone can stand being married to them, let alone allow them to inflict themselves on a baby. So that's an example of, how pervasive and how present stigma continues to be. I'm going to turn now to the definition of stigma, just to kind of get us all on the same page with this. And there are 4 definitions that are mentioned here. The first one is a small mark, spot, or hole, and that one's more from a biological perspective. The one we're going to consider most in our discussion tonight is this second one, a mark of disgrace or infamy, a stain or reproach. That's the sociological explanation of stigma. Third, a mental or physical mark that is characteristic of a defect or disease. And most of us have heard the word stigmata to refer to the marks resembling the crucified wounds of Jesus Christ. So these are the 4 definitions that appear in most dictionaries about stigmata as the plural of stigma. The origin of stigma as an idea of a mark came from ancient Greece, as many things in our culture do today. The word stigma meant mark, and that marks were placed on slaves to identify their position in society. If not by the mark, you couldn't tell by looking who was a slave and who was a citizen. And people have always, throughout written history, needed to know where they stand in relation to another person. And so throughout history, people have been given marks, either through our dress or our or physical marks placed upon us, to know, where do I stand in relation to this person? And that's particularly true when we don't know the other person. One of the earlier writers about stigma was the great American sociologist Irving Goffman, who wrote the highly influential book, Stigma, Notes on the Management of a Spoiled Identity. He suggests that stigma has really 2 components, both equal in power. One is a public component, and that is the reaction that the general public has to a stigmatized group. So this is external stigma coming in, the public has against another person. But equally powerful, he asserts, is the sense of self-stigma, and that is the negative feelings towards self that people who are stigmatized turn toward themselves. Okay, so that both forces act upon an individual person to marginalize them in society, both the external stigma and the internalized stigma. And his books are, continue to be as relevant today as they were when he wrote them in the early 60s. I think in all of his books, he makes a very passionate defense of the individual self against society. So that the need for the self to express itself in a society that may stifle it. And Stigma was one of his most referenced books. So we talked about internalized and external stigma from Goffman. Link and Phelan go further to sort of conceptualize 4 components of stigma. And these components are first, labeling and differentiation. Labeling is just giving characteristics of a person. Someone is tall, they're short, they're blonde, they're fat, they're single, they're rich, they live in Wellesley. So these are just labels that we might put on something. They don't in and of themselves perhaps have much meaning. The next aspect of stigma, though, is linking that to stereotypes. Okay, and that is linking a set of beliefs to a label. So if we say, blondes are dumb, they have more fun though, and they're promiscuous. So those are the kind of the stereotypes of blondes. Now again, not all stereotypes have negative connotations. The idea of blondes having more fun is not necessarily a negative connotation. But with stigma, negative connotation happens, that the characteristics associated with the stereotypes are devalued. They're not, prized in the society. And then thirdly, there's an us versus them disconnect. My group and your group. There's a real disconnect mentality. So for example, people on welfare spend my hard-earned money. Okay, so the stigmatized group being people who are living in poverty, having public support, who spend my tax dollar. The us versus them mentality. And so stigma, all four characteristics need to be present. This loss of status and discrimination is the result of stigma. But all need to be present for stigma to happen. Labeling, stereotype, and creating an us versus them connotation. And there needs to be a consequence of that. So therefore, the person is marginalized. Okay. We'll be talking about some aspects of these components, but we want to talk a little bit about why is mental illness stigmatized? What is it about mental illness that causes it to be a stigmatized condition and has been a stigmatized condition for much of our history? I do want to make one cultural point here, that it's not true in every culture that mental illness is stigmatized. That'd be something interesting to read up on if you have time. Not every culture stigmatizes people with mental illness. But in our, mental illnesses that are associated with symptoms that the average person hasn't experienced are more stigmatized than those that are more common. So, for example, the diagnosis of schizophrenia, which often has symptoms that the average person perhaps has not experienced, audio hallucination, thought disorder, ideas of reference, visual hallucinations, is much more stigmatized than, say, major depression, which may have more people can identify with the symptoms or the experience of depression. And it's also true that people are fascinated with stories of mental illness and violence. The media bias, which amplifies the presence of mental illness, particularly if it's associated with a story of graphic violence. And this works both ways, the media bias and the public's hunger for those kinds of stories. And it's interesting that because despite many studies to the contrary, people with mental illness are viewed as violent, when in fact they are much more likely to be victims of violence than to perpetrate any violence. But we never hear if a victim is experiencing mental illness, only if a perpetrator. So this belief that people with mental illnesses are unpredictable, incompetent, and hopeless informs a lot of the news media. And also the entertainment media, if you think about movies and television shows. The next slide continues to say more about why mental illnesses are stigmatized. I think in general that the name mental illnesses implies that it's very different from a physical illness. It's in a category all onto itself. And because of that, or in addition to that, some people believe that mental illnesses are caused by moral flaws or poor choices, that there's no other basis for it but poor choices in people, in their lives. Some people also believe that the person could just get over it if he tried hard enough. So that again, it's a moral flaw that the person doesn't have the willingness to overcome their mental illness. And if they did, they would no longer be struggling. And I also want to make the point that mental illnesses can lead to other stigmatized conditions. Either the illness itself, stigma and the illness, or the treatment for many mental illnesses can lead to other stigmatized conditions. And so one's not only dealing with the stigma of mental illness, but perhaps also the stigma of poverty, which in this country is seen as a shameful thing. Obesity, many of the medications increase a person's, a body mass a great deal. Obesity is a highly stigmatized condition in the United States. Poor dental health. Dental health in this country is a socioeconomic indicator, and so it's very stigmatizing to have poor dental health. And then extrapyramidal signs, neurological signs that I am using medication or that I have used medication and having neurological signs are also very stigmatized. And so people who are living with mental illness are experiencing stigma from a variety of sources. Okay, we'll go to the next slide because I want to talk about the consequences of stigma for people with mental illness. One of the biggest consequences is the estimates that over 2/3 or nearly 2/3 of people who have diagnosable mental illnesses do not seek treatment. So 2/3 don't seek treatment because, in part or wholly, due to the stigma of mental illness. People live with distressing symptoms for a long time before seeking treatment. Okay. People with mental illnesses may not know that recovery is possible. It is true that mental health professionals are not immune to the stigma of mental illness, that mental health professionals may also perpetuate the stigma. And they do this when they deliver uniformly poor prognoses to people with mental illness, when in fact most people can and do recover from mental illnesses. They do this when they have very low expectations. They communicate stigma in their uninspiring programs, in their hopeless feeling environments. And so that people with mental illnesses don't get the message that recovery is possible, and in fact, recovery is likely. Consequently, suicide rates for people diagnosed with mental illnesses are much, much higher than the general public, and in part due to stigma. And it has been reported that self-stigma or internalized stigma is a painful side effect of being diagnosed with a major mental illness. Okay, some additional consequences for people with mental illnesses is that stigma leads to discrimination in housing and employment. Stigma contributes to the great disparities of health care and support services for people with mental illness. Our insurance companies support services and care for physical illnesses at much greater rates than for psychiatric illnesses. And that the financing of mental health service is inadequate, leading to very unappealing mental health programs. If you've ever visited some of the public mental health programs, there are some shining exceptions to this generalization, but many of them are environments that do not inspire hope, to put it lightly. We've had enormous budget cuts in Massachusetts, and mental health care was one of the hardest hits service sectors. So we'll go to the next slide. Another whole slide on the consequences for people with mental illness. That people drop out of psychiatric services, in part because they do not want to be known as using mental health services. They don't want to be associated with mental health services. This is particularly true for young adults, college-age students, not wanting to participate in services that are in these unappealing environments that are communicating hopelessness and not messages of recovery. Stigma, this internalized stigma, leads to social withdrawal, thus depriving people with mental illnesses of the helpful connections and supports. The recovery research has demonstrated over the past, 15 years that research has been done about the importance of connection and support in people's experience of recovery. And then we have these two powerful forces: external stigma, which pushes people away to the margins, and internalized stigma, which causes people to withdraw socially. So we have programs that perhaps communicate hopelessness along with isolation. That's a great recipe for despair. And despair is not the environment where we heal from any condition, whether that be heart disease, mental illness, a fractured leg. A person's experience of despair inhibits the healing that's necessary. And so we do see that community attitudes negatively influence recovery rates. But there's more in terms of consequences, because we can look at the consequences for family members. People who are diagnosed with mental illnesses have parents, children, sisters, brothers, husbands, wives. Family members are also impacted by the diagnosis. And very often, family members may feel that they are to blame for the illness, particularly parents. They feel that I've done something wrong. And when people feel blamed, they may feel defensive or ashamed. It's difficult to ask for help when you believe something is all your fault. Family members may also feel ashamed, and reluctant to ask for help. Once again, there are two forces here, the kind of this internalized stigma that causes me to feel ashamed about what's happening in my family, and this external stigma coming from many mental health professionals who say things, well, the nut doesn't fall that far from the tree, does it? Insinuating that, the whole family is ill, or, really blaming parents for their struggles of their children. And at this time, when a family member is diagnosed with a psychiatric illness, living with a psychiatric illness, families need an increased amount of support to cope with mental illness, rather than, less support. What families tend to do, like the individual with mental illness, is withdraw, isolate, not seek help. Okay, so that's for individuals and for family members, but there are also consequences for society at large, for all of us, for anyone. Now, probably in the first two categories, people with mental illness or a family member, included most of us, in this room, or most of us listening in the classrooms out above, because mental illness touches most people's lives. If you personally haven't struggled or experienced it, someone has or family member has. But this last slide on consequences is talking about kind of the consequences for all of us, any one of us. That discrimination leads to the very, very low rates of employment for people with psychiatric disabilities. So stigma, which fuels discrimination, contributes to the low rates of employment. And it's estimated that that about 80 to 90% of people diagnosed with serious mental illness are unemployed. Discrimination also contributes to much higher rates of homelessness for people with psychiatric disabilities. It contributes to the fact that there's very limited mental health services in most states. If you've ever had the experience of seeking mental health services, It can be very, very challenging to find a service that accepts you or accepts your family member, that takes your insurance, that doesn't have a waiting list, that is attractive, that is something you want to participate in. And even if you find one, this last thing, insurers often create barriers to access mental health services. So if you think a loved one needs to be in the hospital and you seek those services, your insurer might say, no, let's try him at a day program, or let's try him in outpatient psychotherapy first, when you've just gotten your loved one willing to participate in services. So insurers create additional barriers. And again, these are consequences, in part, consequences of stigma surrounding mental illness, so that it has a very personal level, that people are impacted personally. But there's also many societal ramifications of this stigma. Okay, so we're going to shift a little bit and talk about coping with stigma. How do people cope with stigma? And these next few slides are perhaps geared more toward people who've had the lived experience or are having the lived experience of psychiatric illness, but family members also, and I think the general public. First of all, educating yourself about mental illnesses, educating yourself and educating others. There's a lot that's now known about mental illness, about its, etiology, if the cause, or treatments, or symptoms, or ways of managing the illness. To insist on adequate and appropriate treatment for yourself or for a friend or family member. That's easier said than done, but to, after doing research, insist on that. Don't equate yourself with your illness. Illness is just a small part of who a person is. It's just one aspect. Speak up about stigma and discrimination. Don't let it, take over. Speak up when you see it. And this is also easier said than done, but don't let stigma create shame and self-doubt. That is a fight that most people with mental illnesses learn that they must have on a daily basis, to step up and say, you know what, I'm not going to let this cause me to feel shame or to doubt myself. Some of the ways to kind of manage reduce the shame and increase your self-confidence is to surround yourself with supportive people. They're out there. The importance of support and connection. So surrounding yourself with supportive people. Connect with others who are living with mental illnesses. Share your experiences. Educate or avoid people who demonstrate negative attitudes toward you, toward mental illness, because of your diagnosis. Now, I had the experience of living with cancer about 5 years ago, and these steps of, cancer was once a very stigmatized condition, but the world has changed around that. In terms of education, every hospital I went to had a cancer education center for their patients. Psychiatric hospitals don't have those. All the information you could possibly want about cancer. However, the internet is a pretty good source of information about mental illnesses. Advocating for appropriate treatment, my insurance paid for a second opinion. They encouraged me to get a second opinion. They don't pay for a second psychiatric, opinion. Speaking up and connecting with other people who are living with cancer. The hospital offered support groups for women who were living with the same kind of cancer that I had. So, this branch of medicine, in this case oncology, has moved to a place that assists people to cope with any stigma or the challenges of the illness. Stigma does still exist. There was one woman in my life who was pretty sure my cancer was caused by repressed anger. And my anger wasn't so repressed after she let me know that was probably the cause. And, I didn't hang out with her a lot during my treatment. I chose to be with people who are much more positive and supportive. And the kind of the vision we could have for mental health treatment, not that coping with mental illness and is going to eliminate stigma, but it will help us start. One of the visions we have is to, have these education centers for people who are diagnosed with mental health issues. Encourage second opinions, third opinions, fourth opinions if the treatment plan isn't working well for you. Surrounding yourself with supportive people, connecting with others who are living with the same condition. Okay, so I'll go to the next slide as we talk about coping and confronting stigma. People with mental illnesses have joined together to assist each other to cope with stigma. There's a lot of peer support and mutual support groups. People have also formed or joined advocacy groups to fight for the rights of people diagnosed with mental illnesses. The Mental Health Advocacy Coalition, the National Association for Protection and Advocacy, and many, many, many more. This is another kind of area I'd encourage you to get online and look at what's out there. There are an enormous number of groups out there for people. But I want to talk about something we do right here at Boston University in our Recovery Education Center. Since 2002, students of Boston University's Recovery Education Center have been taking a class called the Anti-Stigma Empowerment and Advocacy Photovoice to document stigma and advocate for changes in policies, attitudes, and practices. Okay. Now, probably see the word Photovoice and wonder, well, what is that? Photovoice is a research process, but it's a process by which people can identify, represent, and enhance their community through the creation of photographs and narratives designed to capture important aspects of the community experience. So a group of citizens or community members come together and with cameras capture in pictures and then write narratives in words some phenomenon in their community. In this case, here at the center, we were looking at stigma. Okay. Now I want to say a bit about Photovoice, that it was a concept first developed in the field of public health by Caroline Wang and Marianne Burris. And they used Photovoice to study many phenomenon in a variety of communities, whether it was, with young women who were pregnant in Detroit, or rural women in China. They put cameras in the hands of these underrepresented groups and had them go out and kind of capture in pictures and words what was happening in their community. I'm going to go to the next slide. The Photovoice process is pretty easy. It's not rocket science, as we say. We come together as a class and we think about and discuss the issue. In this case, stigma. What is stigma? How have you experienced stigma? What are the negative labels associated with stigma? We think early and often, who are our audiences? Who in our community need to see our work? Who needs to learn about stigma? And we have brainstormed a list of people, including, the commissioner of mental health to, the pastor at someone's local church and the other church members. And so we think through of who are the audiences. Certainly other people with mental illnesses, mental health professionals. Because the purpose of Photovoice is not just for us as a class to have this kind of cathartic opening experience, although that does happen. The real purpose of Photovoice is to educate policymakers and citizens to change attitudes. We brainstorm together, think through ideas of what would make a good photograph. And most times people as we think in the classroom, people draw a blank. But once you put the cameras in the hands of people, the imaginations run wild. And taking photographs is the next step. Then we share and discuss our photographs. We write a narrative that accompanies the photograph that says, picture's worth 1,000 words. We add another 200, 100 to 200 words to really flesh out that picture. And then we show our work. And I have a couple of examples here. The next slide, though, I just want to make a couple more points about Photovoice. First, that we have trained 12 people who are living with psychiatric disability, mental illnesses, to be trainers in Photovoice. And so this will be, a peer-led class from now on. That Photovoice has been exhibited in galleries at the State House, mental health programs, churches, etc. And we were featured in a 12-minute documentary. We didn't have enough time to show that to you tonight, but it was aired on cable television. We're quite proud of that piece. But I want to show you a picture and read the narrative so that you can have a firsthand experience of what Photovoice might be like. This is a picture taken by a woman in our Photovoice class, and you can see that it's a picture of a brick sidewalk with a drain. And she says, "This drain calls to me because of the hurtful things people have said to me over the decades about my mental illness. In some, I have been told that I am a drain on the nation, on society, a drain on multiple individuals' resources. Over the years, I have come to believe this, which has become a drain on me. Education about mental illness and the effects of trauma should be able to reach out to the general public as well as healthcare professionals. Knowledge and understanding can be powerful weapons in combating stigma." Okay, so that's one example of Photovoice, and a Photovoice that captured an aspect of stigma. Now, one picture and one narrative doesn't get the whole message across, but what happens when a whole class does a series of pictures and narrative, the pictures kind of speak in concert and give a whole message about Photovoice, about stigma, I'm sorry. We'll go not to the next one, but the one after that, Sue, please. Okay. These handouts, these PowerPoint slides will be put up on the net. They'll be archived very soon so you can have them, and there are a couple more examples, but I'm mindful of the time. This was a self-portrait done by one of the members in the Photovoice class, and he writes this. Newly diagnosed with manic depression, Bobby told his best friend of his illness over a game of golf, only to be hurt and amazed when his buddy literally had nothing to say. Bobby's immediate family chooses to be mute on the subject as well, so that his only sources of support and validation come from his wife and therapist. It's no wonder that Bobby has chosen to champion his own cause, including converting the front of his Jeep into a billboard protesting stigma toward the mentally ill. And what you may not be able to see in this picture clearly is that in front, his front license plate says, "Stop the stigma." Okay. We'll go to the next. So we think about ourselves and confronting stigma. To begin, one of the things is to avoid prejudging people who are diagnosed with mental illness. One of the things to do this may be an automatic response, that we too are members of this society, and so we've been exposed to stigma for so long that it may be an automatic thought. We can only avoid this if we're aware of it, recognizing it in ourselves. To join a group that advocates for people with mental illness. Monitor the media, talk openly about mental illness, and then watching our language. Now, most of you are rehabilitation counselors and students in rehab programs, and so you've probably had a lot of lectures on language. But the next slide shows us some of the, disrespectful, stigmatizing language versus language that's more respectful. We, in mental health, as in physical disability, talk about people first language. We don't talk about people as manic depressive or the schizophrenic, but rather the person who's diagnosed with bipolar disorder, person diagnosed with schizophrenia, person experiencing homelessness, etc. You know that we don't often use the word normal. We refer to them as a person who is not disabled. And then acronyms, the alphabet soup that comes in our field of medicine and health and mental health. So many of these acronyms marginalize a lot of people, keep them out and away from our jargon. So rather than calling people SPMI, severely and persistently mentally ill, or, MICA, M-I-C-A, which is somebody who has a mental illness and also an addiction disorder. To watch ourselves, watching our language, being aware of our language. And then also monitoring the media, writing to newspapers who sensationalize crimes by reporting that the perpetrator of the crime had mental illness. Watching movies or monitoring movies that perpetuate stereotypes of mental illnesses and develop campaigns, develop a campaign or join a campaign to boycott these movies. There were several movies, I can't think of the titles, that over the years have had boycotts organized about them because of their language and the disparaging remarks or portrayals of people with mental illness or developmental disabilities. And then finally, writing the networks who produce television shows that depict stereotypes of mental illnesses. The networks tend to be more responsive than even the movie industry, because they're concerned about their sponsors. The National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, NAMI, has a very effective media watch, a media campaign, and they're very sensitive to portrayals of people with mental illnesses. And so again, looking online to see what are the campaigns in your area? What are the media watch campaigns that are happening? Not that, writing a letter to the newspaper isn't going to change the way they write, but over time. And you can see, or some of us who are older can see, how language has changed over time, slowly, but in the right direction. I do want to spend a few minutes just on talking about stigma, mental illness, and colleges. This is an area of concern for the country. The national government is now concerned more about mental health on campus. It's just the next slide. Yep. College-age adults are especially vulnerable to emotional difficulties and depression. And in fact, adults ages 18 to 25 report more distressing feelings more often than any other groups of adults. 1 in 3 college students experienced prolonged periods of depression. 1 in 4 students report having suicidal thoughts or feelings. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in college students. 1 in 7 students report difficulty functioning at school due to mental illness. These are large numbers. Despite the fact that every school has free and accessible counseling services, and most of them have, sophisticated behavioral health services. The next slide, please. That stigma and discrimination are major reasons why college students do not seek help in college health centers. Students are often uneducated about the signs and the prevalence of mental health problems in young adults. And significant others, that is family members and professors and even counselors, are very tempted to minimize a young person's symptoms and their suffering. Very reticent to say this could be something that medication might help. This could be more than just a bad weekend. Let's see if some psychiatric care and support would help. The next slide talks about Active Minds, which is a nationwide campus-based organization, a national organization based on college and university campuses to help reduce the stigma of mental health problems and help-seeking behaviors, and to teach students how to assist friends who are struggling with emotional or psychiatric problems. Students live in close proximity to each other, so it's very important that we have the skills to reach out to one another. How do I help a roommate who hasn't eaten in a week? Or how do I help a good friend who hasn't left her room? Or someone who's drinking heavily. A lot of students don't have the skill to do that. And so colleges are looking at these issues with much more concern. So we talk about trying to increase awareness and reduce stigma. That's to put information and signage about mental health in high traffic areas. Very often, mental health services are in the basement of some obscure building that no one ever goes to, and to put them in much more kind of mainstream central place, to incorporate mental health issues in orientations and other college-wide information centers, to make presentations about mental health in classes, in just general classes, to train campus leaders, that is, resident advisors and officers, and to offer mental health screening days to students. So these are just a few suggestions to begin to increase awareness, reduce stigma in mental health, for mental health on campus. My hope is that it'll generate some discussion amongst the students listening to this class. What are the mental health issues on your campus? What are the mental health resources necessary? And what experiences of stigma and discrimination have you witnessed? I'm going to close with that because I want to leave some time for questions, and it is close to 10 of 8. I have on the general, on the PowerPoint slides, I've listed a half dozen websites. 3 are for kind of general anti-stigma websites, and then 3 are anti-stigma websites specifically for college students. I'll show the next one. Specifically for college students. And we do have a few questions, so I'm going to take those now. Okay. All right. What do you do? This is a good question. What do you do when someone you work with who is in authority makes an inappropriate remark about a person with mental illness or their treatment? That's a very good question, and not an uncommon experience, particularly if you're going out to internships. It can be very risky to confront an authority figure in front of other colleagues, but one might have an opportunity to speak privately, one-on-one with them, to express your disappointment, your concern, your even offense, if that is what you feel, to say, rather than, not to be necessarily language police, but if it's a disparaging remark, to bring it to her attention. One of the kind of consequences sometimes of working in mental health settings is that people get very casual about their language. One of the great benefits of having people who are diagnosed with mental illness in the workplace is that it continues to help people stay aware of their language. And so you might be the person on the staff that, works to increase awareness. So I would advocate speaking privately to a supervisor or person in authority about the language issue. Here's another question. What do you think is the role of stigma in disproportionately high convictions of persons with mental illness and its impact on perpetuating unemployment, poverty, and homelessness? What kind of law reform is being looked at? Well, there are many different things. The convictions meaning for crime. There are many. One of the consequences of a poor mental health system, of a service net that is not attending to people's basic needs in addition to their mental health needs, is this enormous rate in of people with serious mental illnesses being charged and convicted of crimes and spending time in prison, in jails. There is some law reform looking at mental health courts and drug courts to help people avert doing criminal time and instead getting linked into mental health services and supports. Not every state has these mechanisms, but many states are looking at those mechanisms. And there are other things in terms of organizing mental health services around people who have the highest need for services and supports. Case management was a response in one way, and some of the more intensive models of case management have been used to assist people who are at risk for jail or at risk for homelessness. Unemployment, homelessness, substance use are really a formula for criminal activity, and they're, in addition, having additional supports is helpful. And then what are some of the world's cultures where mental illness is not stigmatized? Well, these cultures are getting fewer and further between, but there are still some cultures, certainly some tribal cultures in Africa in which serious mental illness is not looked upon as something negative, but perhaps the person is different and in touch with spirits. More, I don't want to use the word primitive, but more kind of village, tribal-based cultures that continue to have roles for people who have psychiatric illnesses tend not to stigmatize it as much. The more developed or developing and kind of first world nations tend to have the highest degrees of stigma. Okay, are there any other questions in? I'm getting signals. Are there more questions? Okay, you can call some questions in if you haven't already called them in. The number again is 1 area code 508-843-6042. Thank you. Write it down. Oh, wait, there's a mic. Go ahead, Stephanie. Go ahead. There's a microphone there. You can.
Okay, thank you. What should someone do?
A little technical difficulty. We're trying to get a microphone to the in-house audience right now.
What should someone do if they have a very dear friend who is so near coming to the edge, and that person makes you swear that they don't want you to discuss it with anyone who might help that person, because they feel that if they are once again stigmatized like that by being talked about, that they will go over the edge.
Sounds like the question you've probably heard, what do you do when a friend asks you not to say anything because they don't wish to be stigmatized again, and yet you see them going over the edge, and it sounds like they've put you in a very difficult situation. I mean, I think if I'm speaking now, not maybe directly to your question, but to college students, what do you do when someone says, don't tell anybody that, I'm not eating, or that I'm so depressed, or that I cut myself? What do you do? And you may have to respond that I can't promise that I'm not going to tell, because I'd like to see you get some help. I'd like you to get some help with your difficulty. And I think one of the reasons people talk about, don't tell anybody, is fear of stigma, fear of discrimination. Certainly on college campuses, mental health authority there is often very well conditioned to attend to the issues of young adults. And so eating disorders, self-injury, depression, anxiety disorders are quite common on college campuses, and mental health resources are geared toward assisting people. So you may not be able to keep your promise of not telling anybody is probably the best response. If you're concerned about somebody falling over the edge, you may not be able to keep your promise. Okay, another question? No, we haven't had any phone calls, so that's a very good thing. All right. Okay, one more here. Sorry, there is another question.
As a family member, I wonder how things could be different. How can I teach my grandchildren about the mental illness in my family?
Yeah.
Generational.
Right, generational. How can we teach our families? One of the things that has happened that is very, very promising is most bookstores have an enormous section on recovery. And that used to be just recovery from, addiction, to alcohol and drugs. Now the recovery section talks a lot about depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. So if you visit a bookstore, you're very likely to find some good quality books. Now that may be more true in great metropolitan centers. The substance abuse, one of the websites that I gave you, in the slide before this, Sam said the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration is the federal agency that oversees mental health services. And they have some very good pamphlets that give information about a variety of disorders, kind of what are the symptoms, what is the typical treatment, talks a lot about it. And often now in their flyers, it's not just a kind of a clinical picture, they have first-person accounts, first-person stories of people who experience that disorder. And so they can be a great source of free resources. They also have some things for children, geared toward children who have parents or perhaps grandparents who are living with mental health issues. SAMS also has information for children who may be experiencing some mental health issues for the very first time. So really, for the first time in history, mental health services are moving in the direction that many of the other fields of medicine have moved toward, patient education, patient empowerment, thinking about choice, thinking of, personal goals. There's a long way to go, but that's beginning. And so we can hope that a decade from now, 2 decades from now, stigma will be, something of the past. Stigma and mental health issues may be something more of the past. In the history of the United States, there have been groups that have been stigmatized, and we don't even know it. Like, it's not even a part of it now. Like here in Boston, the Irish were very stigmatized against about 50 years ago. And now, not at all. It's a dim memory. Most people don't even reach back that far, and so there's mental health may go the same way. Mental illness may go the same way of stigma being reduced. Usually, how that happens is high-profile people begin to talk about it. We've been very fortunate in this country that we've had First Lady Rosalind Carter and Tipper Gore. I guess Second Lady, former Second Lady Tipper Gore, who have taken on mental health issues and stigma of mental illness as core challenges for them. They've really fought against it. The Carter Center in Atlanta, Georgia is a wonderful resource to go for information about stigma and stigma busting kinds of activities. Okay. Do we have time for one more question? I don't think so. Well, do we have time for one more question? One more. Yep. Okay. A short one. Easy one. No.
Okay. Just became aware 2 weeks ago from looking at his Facebook, my 21-year-old nephew has it written out that he's feeling very suicidal. He is an acknowledged drug addict. He is an alcoholic. And he is gay, and I'm not putting in gay there because I think there's a problem with that. as opposed to that poses many issues for a young man in the world. And he's not going to be graduating from college in May, as my brother and sister-in-law thought. The bottom line is that I don't know what to do because neither my brother nor my sister-in-law tolerate depression or any
So as an aunt,
psychological
what
issues.
could be your role? And it's very difficult when you're not a parent, and it's very difficult with young adults. The person 21 years old is an adult and can make his own decisions about what kind of services and supports that I'm willing to go for. For many people, the role of the aunt is to give unconditional love and support, praise and encouragement, and that's the role of an aunt. And I think that's, the one we have to embrace as family members.